Okay, welcome everyone. Delighted to see you all here tonight. My name's Guy Osborn. I'm from Westminster Law School and Director of the Centre for Law, Society and Popular Culture. With that, all I can say is I'm really delighted to have this event going on. We've had a long relationship with Sheridan's, especially with Daniel and Andrew, Johnny and Chris, but they've put together a fantastic panel tonight. The way this is going to work is that Daniel's going to say a few textual things to start, and then pass over to Andrew, who's going to do a sort of a state-of-the-art overview of esports and what they are and some of the implications around that. Before we pass over to Johnny, who's going to talk about, who's going to chair the panel itself and introduce you to the panellists themselves. Without further ado, I will pass you over to Daniel Geey.
Thanks, Guy. So, by way of just a very brief introduction, my name's Daniel Geey. I am a partner at Sheridan's. I'm one of the lawyers in Andrew's team. And I just wanted to give a very brief introduction, just to give a tiny bit of context for this evening. So, firstly, a big thank you to all of you guys for turning up. Thank you for those that are watching this stream live. Firstly, also a big thank you to the panellists. I know Andrew and Johnny will sort of introduce you guys separately when the time arrives. But also really just to explain a little bit about Sheridan. So Sheridan's is a multidisciplinary law firm just like many others, but I think one of the things that sets us apart is, and I'm sure Andrew and Johnny and Chris will vouch for that as well, is where some of our current and contemporary expertise lies. That's specifically in the esports space, and that's really a crossover hybrid between our sort of globally award-winning games team that we've had at Sheridan's over a significant period of time, and our sports group, which now has 4, sometimes 5 dedicated guys in the sports team. And that overlap between the gaming and the sports world has enabled us to become what we believe, at least, to be some of the leading lawyers in esports in the UK. And what the evening is here to try and hopefully provide for everyone is a contextual overview of what we believe to be some of the most important issues in esports and give a sort of beginner's guide. And then a more detailed, in-depth understanding from the panel, who are gratefully appreciative to be along here tonight, to try and dig into some more of the more detailed and nuanced topics that are going to envelop the esports industry over the next period of time. So, without further ado, thank you very much for coming. I'm going to hand you over to Andrew, who will give you that contextual overview.
Thanks very much, Dan, for that introduction. As Dan mentioned, my role this evening is really just to give an overview of the industry in order to segue into the panel, which Johnny will chair later on this evening. Dan's already given us a bit of an overview in terms of what we're going to be covering this evening. Obviously, I'll talk a little bit about Sheridan's and embellish what Dan has just said. Then I'll delve into the industry itself, looking at some of the numbers, the audience, the key stakeholders, and some of the legal issues and challenges that arise. And then, as I say, we'll neatly segue into the panel and they'll excavate some of these issues in a bit more detail. As Dan mentioned, a little bit about Sheridan's. We're a full-service but specialist firm, and we focus on the interactive media and entertainment industries. And under that broad umbrella, we do a lot of work within the music sector, film and television, sport, and obviously esports, computer games, data, fashion, retail, advertising, and brands. And indeed, why has esports become such a big part of our practice? As Dan alluded to, we obviously have one of the leading sports teams and the leading standalone computer games department. And I guess when you combine those technical and commercial and legal skill sets, you have quite a robust offering to the industry. So for us, it's been very much a natural progression. Okay, so the esports industry, the question people often ask is, what the hell is esports? And I've taken this definition from Newzoo, which is a Dutch-based marketing and analytics company which focuses predominantly on the computer games industry, but also has a sub-expertise in esports. And they define esports as competitive gaming in an organised format, an event or league organised by a third party with a specific goal, i.e. winning a tournament or prize money, with a clear distinction between players and teams who are competing against each other for a chance to reach that goal. Now that's a perfectly competent definition. The reason why I've square bracketed and highlighted the final 2/3 is, at least in my view, those 2/3 are somewhat superfluous. My take on it is that esports is competitive gaming in a broadly speaking organised format, whether or not that is grassroots level right through to elite esports. There are those who take the view that esports only is the top layer of the traditional pyramid, but as I say, my view is slightly different on that. It's also important to bear in mind that esports is a media-friendly term. You might even say that it is a media-invented term, and it's also an umbrella term as well. That's quite an important point, in exactly the same way that sport is an umbrella term. So under the umbrella of sport, you have all of the individual sports, the rugbies, the footballs, the crickets, the tennises, the golfs of this world, and exactly the same point applies to esports. Under that umbrella, you have all of the individual game titles, so the League of Legends, Counter-Strike Go's, Smites, Hearthstones, FIFAs of this world. Another question we often get asked is it a sport? Now, I'm not going to get into a discussion and a debate on that. The panel may do a bit later on. And I'll leave you to make an assessment of that yourself. And in order to assist you with that, I've added in onto the slides the Council of Europe Sports Charter definition of sport. And as I say, you can assess it for yourself and you can determine whether or not you consider it to be a sport. My take on it is that it doesn't matter a jot. I view esports in exactly the same way that I view traditional sports, i.e. as a set of rights which is capable of being commercialized and an entertainment product. And make no mistake, esports is a successful entertainment product. Okay, esports as an industry hasn't just appeared from the ether out of nowhere, albeit you could be forgiven for thinking that it has, given the amount of media hype that has attached itself to the industry over the last 18 months or so. In fact, esports has a reasonably long history. Competitive gaming, for example, is as old as the video games industry itself. You could go back to the late 70s and early 80s to the Atari Masters for an early adoption version of esports. Clearly, the internet was an important development in that it brought with it PC gaming, which has been a major catalyst for growth within the industry. And I guess if you look at esports as a visual, as an industry today, it's been gaining momentum in that direction for over a decade or so, starting in Asia and then moving into North America and laterally Europe and the rest of the world. I think most people agree that 2016 was a very important year for esports. It went from, I guess, underground to more mainstream. And in 2017, the industry will consolidate further. And we're likely to see an influx of commercial partners, new investors into the space. And I also take the view that the industry will start to get a handle on how it commercializes its premium esports content. So why is all of this the case? Well, as I said, the evolution of the internet was key, but for me, digital streaming is the biggest reason for the success of esports today. Digital platforms have allowed esports to connect to tens of millions of eyeballs around the world, and that's why we have quite an exciting industry on our hands. Okay, so what does esports look like now as at 2017? Well, we have a range of global and multi-jurisdictional leagues around the world across different game titles, from grassroots through to elite professional. In many ways, it's quite a fragmented space. The narrative is not always that clear, which makes it something of a challenge for brands who want to activate in the space, and the panel will talk a bit later on about that. Most of the successful games are PC-based, but console and mobile gaming is also starting to gain traction. And just as with traditional sport, we have professional teams and players, and we've also had the recent advent of mainstream sports brands investing into esports teams. Only a few weeks ago, the Miami Heat invested in Misfits, a Florida-based esports team, and at the back of last year, the Philadelphia 76ers, another NBA team, acquired Team Dignitas and Team Apex. Just as with traditional sport, we see significant sums of prize money in play. And it's also important to bear in mind that esports, and I think this is a fair summary, esports is mature in relation to major events. If you go along to an esports championship series event or an ESL event, you will witness a production which is just as sophisticated as any major arena-based traditional sports event. And of course, we have the accepted methods of commercializing rights within esports, which are broadly speaking not dissimilar to traditional sports. So broadcasting and media, sponsorship, branding, merchandising, ticketing and hospitality, betting, and of course major events. Now, as we'll see a bit later on when the panel take the stage, esports is obviously less mature than traditional sport in relation to some of these commercial facets, particularly in relation to media rights and also in relation to merchandising. Merchandising presents, in my view at least, vast opportunities for the teams, but it's still some way behind the 8 ball in creating a robust licensing model to support that. Okay, some numbers. I'm only going to hover on this slide and just make a couple of headline points here. I'll let you digest this data in your own time. I do want to make the point that whilst these numbers are interesting, whilst they, on the face of it, look significant, they're also in many ways insignificant when you compare it to traditional sports. And that's an important point. There's been a lot of hype around the value of the esports industry. Some of that is justified, but a lot of it is also unjustified. That said, the key thing about this data is that it is on an upward curve, particularly in relation to media rights, particularly in relation to brand spend and activation within esports. And indeed, those last 2 bullet points or hyphenated points on the slide, I just want to quickly hone in on. In that regard, you have thousands of people, tens of thousands of people going through the proverbial turnstiles. And you also have millions of people, tens of millions of people occasionally consuming this content via digital platforms and increasingly via traditional broadcast platforms. And when you put those 2 facets together, as I said earlier, you definitely have an industry on your hands. Okay, so the esports economy. This is just a spider diagram that we have created, I guess, from our experience over the last couple of years or so. Some of you may agree with it, some of you may disagree with it. But in order to map the industry, it's very important to get under the skin of the key stakeholders. And indeed, I guess the first thing you will think is that there is a lot of similarities with traditional sport. However, like everything connected to esports, it isn't quite that clear cut. For example, in traditional sport, stakeholder roles within the industry are relatively speaking quite clearly defined. Esports, however, is less so. It's a far more fluid stakeholder ecosystem. For example, in esports, publishers can also be rights holders and broadcasters and league organisers. A broadcaster will be a broadcaster, but the broadcaster may also be a rights holder, a league organiser, an events organiser as well. A player, an esports player, is obviously an elite performer, an elite competitive gamer, but they're also a broadcaster, a streaming business in their own right. In exactly the same way, a team is an elite performance unit, but is also a broadcaster, a content business, a streaming business as well. Why is this the case? It's the case because esports is such a digitally native environment and therefore has, relatively speaking, low barriers to entry, which opens up a vast array of opportunities. Now, in order to set the context and the scene for the panel session later on, I just wanted to, get under the skin of some of these key stakeholders. I think that's important from a background perspective, starting with the fans and the consumers. Now, we know there are many esports fans out there. It's actually quite hard to identify and pin down the typical esports fan, not least because they tend to be fans of certain game titles rather than esports as a genre, not dissimilar to the fact that in traditional sport you might be a rugby and a cricket fan but not necessarily a football and a golf fan. What we do know, however, is that the fan base, the consumer base, is predominantly young and male. So one of the challenges for the industry is developing interest within women and girls, and hopefully Carly will talk a bit about that later on. We also know that it's a digitally native demographic, a tech-savvy demographic, and we also know, if the Newzoo data is to be believed, that this is a demographic that has higher disposable income than the average population, which is obviously of interest to brands who want to activate within this space. The challenge, however, in relation to this demographic is that it is a demographic that's not necessarily used to being monetized, but the industry needs to get to that point in order to realize its potential. For example, again, a little bit more Newzoo data, the average consumer spend within esports is only $3.5 per year, and that compares very unfavorably to traditional sport. Indeed, also according to Newzoo, the NBA stands at $20, the NFL stands at $60, so there's a long way to go in that regard. Leagues and tournament organisers, there's obviously a lot of noise on that slide, but it's interesting noise. You have events companies, platforms, streaming sites, talent agencies, game publishers, broadcasters, all who fall into the category of league and tournament organiser. That's back to the point I made earlier. In traditional sport, for example, to broadcast premium content, you need to pay the rights holder a healthy licence fee. In esports, in truth, there are no such barriers, or potentially no such barriers. If you're a broadcaster, yes, you could acquire the rights to content and distribute that content, or you could potentially just create and exploit that content yourself. And indeed, that's what Turner Broadcasting did. Just in the bottom left of the slide. They wanted to enter the esports market. They could obviously have bought rights and exploited those rights in the usual way, but they thought to themselves, we're a media company, we have the technology, we have the infrastructure, we have the money, the funds to create our own league, to create our own content and exploit that content. And they did just that in setting up the E-League in JV with WME and IMG. Streaming platforms. The streaming platforms are the reason why esports is such a significant industry, and I alluded to that briefly earlier. These sites are the reason indeed why we're even having this session this evening, and these sites provide the platform for millions of esports enthusiasts to both create and consume content. Twitch, as per the slide, is one of, if not the biggest player. 90% of esports content goes through Twitch. But like any industry sector, competition is very important, and competitors to Twitch are gaining traction, which is a positive for the industry. For example, YouTube Gaming was launched in August 2015, and recently they acquired the exclusive rights to the ESL Pro League, which is, as I say, is an important step for the industry, and the panel will talk a bit later about that later on. Social platforms inevitably will be next. In fact, they're already in play in the market. Facebook have partnered with Activision Blizzard, and Twitter have added esports to their increasing roster of live sports events. And indeed, only last week did a deal with ESL and DreamHack to stream 1,500 hours of DreamHack and ESL related esports content. Okay, traditional broadcasters. I've bracketed the word traditional because in truth, there is nothing traditional about how linear broadcasters are approaching the esports industry. As mentioned earlier with the Turner E-League example, they're becoming content creators, owners, league organisers in their own right. And this slide gives you insight into the developing interest from traditional media companies. Jinx is quite an interesting one. They're actually part owned by ITV and Sky, and it sits on the Sky platform. You can actually see it at channel 470 if you wish. BT recently acquired the rights to show this year's FIFA Ultimate Team Championship Series only a few weeks ago, and I think that's being shown at the minute. So media companies are definitely interested in esports, but is esports actually interested in traditional broadcasters, in traditional linear media companies? After all, esports has not actually needed traditional broadcast to reach the point it has now reached. The answer to that question has to be yes. Traditional broadcast channels bring credibility, wider exposure, and of course, potentially additional revenue. Okay, the teams. This is just a snapshot of some of the major teams around the world. Most teams focus predominantly on one game title, but the top teams have rosters across a number of different game titles. Fnatic, for example, the top left, as you look at it, one of the top EU teams, they have rosters across Call of Duty, Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Dota 2, Heroes of the Storm, League of Legends, and Overwatch. A really important thing about these teams is, as well as being elite sports teams or esports teams, as I alluded to earlier, they are also content businesses. Prize money and sponsorship are still their biggest revenue sources, but they have lots of challenges in order to find their place within the commercial landscape, a landscape which is becoming increasingly crowded within esports. And indeed, players are becoming increasingly powerful as well in relation to salary demands, and most of the prize money actually is filtered directly to the players. But don't forget, these teams are major brands. A lot of them have significant digital and social presences, and therefore they have significant value in terms of brand partnerships as well. And one thing I just wanted to quickly touch upon, again, to segue into the panel session later. There has, as I mentioned earlier, been a recent spate of teams being acquired by traditional sports franchises. We mentioned the 76ers and the Miami Heat earlier on. Schalke, which I think is up on the slide, the German Bundesliga team, acquired a League of Legends roster last year, as indeed did very recently Paris Saint-Germain. And you'll also have no doubt noted the trend of football teams, Premier League teams in the main, signing, inverted commas signing, FIFA players. Now, whether or not that's an entry into esports in the real sense is a moot point. My view on it is it's just a smart marketing strategy. But as I say, I'm sure the panel will touch upon that a bit later on. Okay, very quickly, the players. In 2010, there were approximately 800 professional esports players. I think the number now is around or about 11,000. This slide gives you some insight into the prize money being earned by the top players, augmented, it must be said, and not insignificantly augmented at times by streaming income. This is not the full story, however. This is very much the tip of the iceberg. A vast majority of players earn very little and struggle to make ends meet as competitive pro gamers. And indeed, as a result, player welfare is a key issue for the industry and needs to be addressed for the continuing growth and stability of esports. Okay, publishers and developers, arguably the most powerful set of stakeholders in the ecosystem. They create the games, they own the game IP. Valve on the slide and also Riot Gaming on the slide are, I guess, two interesting examples, and I just want to have a quick look at them. Valve is the publisher for Counter-Strike Go and Dota, and Riot Gaming is the publisher for League of Legends. And as I say, they're the two major publishers in the space, but interestingly, they both take a slightly different business approach to the esports industry. Riot, on the one hand, controls everything to do with elite competitive League of Legends, both commercially and also from a regulatory perspective. I guess in some ways they are more akin to a traditional style governing body rights holder, a traditional sports style governing body and rights holder. Valve, on the other hand, takes a slightly more hands-off approach, allowing third parties to run and commercialize Counter-Strike Go leagues and events. And that works for Valve because it markets the game globally and drives sales of in-game items. Now, whether or not that's going to be their long-term strategy remains to be seen, and I guess will be contingent to some degree on the increasing value of media rights attached to esports events. Just quickly, I wanted to hover on EA. EA is the publisher of FIFA, which is obviously an esports title which is gaining traction and profile, if not yet entirely industry credibility. You would back EA to make FIFA into an esports title or a successful esports title, but it is still, in real terms, insignificant in terms of prize money and viewing figures. And indeed, it's logical that if you're a football fan, you'd probably rather watch the real thing than a sports simulated version. And indeed, that's probably the challenge for all sports simulated games. Albeit the flip side of that is that from a brand's perspective, from a sponsorship perspective, it's probably an easier sell to brands who probably understand the concept of a sports simulation game rather than perhaps League of Legends, Counter-Strike Go, etc. Okay, last couple of slides on the stakeholders. There's been a lot of hype around this millennial, centennial audience, some of it justified, some of it unjustified. But make no mistake, the demographic is certainly very valuable in terms of its profile. And broadly speaking, esports does give some access to that demographic, arguably more so than traditional sports. Now, as you will expect, there are lots of endemic sponsors already activating within the esports space, mainly gaming-related tech and hardware suppliers and businesses. We are, however, seeing a wave of non-endemic sponsors entering the market, and this slide is a particularly fascinating one. This is a cross-section of the non-endemic sponsors that have entered esports in the last year or so. As you can see, there are tech companies, automobile companies, financial services companies, telecoms companies, FMCGs, and indeed in 2017 alone, we've seen a lot of movement, positive movement in the direction of non-endemics entering esports. SK Gaming, one of the teams that was on the slide earlier on, partnered a few weeks ago with Visa. Astralis, another of the teams that was on the slide, recently entered into a sponsorship deal with Audi. And we're also seeing non-endemic apparel companies joining in. Adidas did a deal recently with the Copenhagen Wolves. Expect to see the likes of Nike, Under Armour and Puma enter the space too, who see themselves very much as lifestyle brands as well as elite performance brands. And of course, it's a good time to potentially enter the space. The value of the rights, at least at present, are relatively low, albeit that will inevitably change. And I'm sure Malf will talk about this a bit later on. But in my view, the key for successful activation within esports is authenticity. Don't just logo plant, show you're investing in the gaming community. Okay, final stakeholder, but nevertheless a very important one. There's always been an endemic betting market around esports, but now major online bookmakers, non-endemic bookmakers, are embedding within the space. You could break esports betting down into cash betting and what's called item betting. Now, item betting, or skins betting as it's sometimes referred to, is very much outside the scope of my high-level overview. It's quite a complex subject in itself. It delves into some of the integrity issues within esports as well. So we'll leave that to one side for the time being and focus on cash betting alone, which is nascent, but we are seeing a product expansion. In-play and micro betting, for example, has huge potential within esports. There are 50 times the number of micro events in a Dota match than there is in a Premier League match. Now, most of the betting in esports surrounds 3 games. They surround League of Legends, Counter-Strike Go, and Dota. That's where most of the betting handle lies. So make no mistake, the development of a betting industry around esports brings with it vast commercial opportunities, but it also brings with it corresponding integrity risks. Risks in relation to underage gambling, risks also in relation to match fixing. There's no doubt that if you had a situation whereby the betting handle, the amount wagered on the tournament, was bigger than the actual prize money on offer, there's always going to be a risk that unscrupulous individuals could infiltrate and manipulate individual players and teams, similar to what has happened within traditional sports. So a really good opportunity for the industry, but it also brings with it integrity risks. Okay, final couple of slides just to segue into the panel. There's no doubt that esports has, like any developing nascent industry, had its growing pains. The fragmented scheduling, the lack of narrative is a point I made earlier, and I'm sure the panel will pick up on that in a bit more detail. We're also in the midst of something of a commercial land grab, and what that does is it potentially creates issues in relation to oversupply, in relation to content and increasingly events. Also, when you're in the midst of a commercial land grab, there's always a danger that the integrity issues, the governance issues, the regulatory issues drift too far down the in-tray. The industry has to bring this straight back up to the top of the in-tray. Doping is not necessarily a huge issue within esports, but then again, you can see how cognitive enhancers, relaxant type drugs, could have a bearing on performance and therefore the integrity of competitions. Player exploitation we touched upon earlier, match fixing we've also just touched upon. There is, some argue, a lack of expertise and there are some knowledge gaps within the industry, but I do think those gaps are starting to be plugged. Certainly, as a lawyer from a non-gaming background, from a traditional sports background, I've always felt very, very much welcomed into the gaming and esports community when I've tried to, I guess, add value within that community. Most stakeholders within the industry respect that and they want that as well. No governing body for esports is one needed. No is the answer to that. There's no doubt that esports has challenges in relation to regulation and governance. It's possible, for example, that integrity issues could be centrally regulated, but the concept of a governing body for esports is a complete misnomer as far as I'm concerned. First of all, esports is just an umbrella term, so if you were to have a governing body, it would have to break down into the individual game titles. And secondly, we're talking about a digitally native, fast-paced environment, and it doesn't really sit all that well with the concept of a traditional sports governing body. Okay, final slide just to lead into the panel. These are just some of the legal issues, legal matters that we have dealt with, some of the matters that have come across our desk at Sheridan's over the last couple of years. Broadcast agreements and content license agreements increasingly important as the industry looks to properly commercialize via exclusivity models its premium content. Esports sponsorship and venue agreements, regulatory frameworks, very important. So the rules not of the game per se, but of the league or competition. And again, you'll notice there are some similarities with traditional sport. Disciplinary and disputes, anti-cheat, which is a bit more esports endemic, transfer regulations, registration of teams and players, financial and commercial regulations, codes of conduct, standard player contracts and minimum terms. An important point that a lot of rights holders, a lot of league organisers are building into their regulations minimum terms of player contracts or for player contracts in order to try and deal with some of those player welfare issues. Publisher licenses, obviously the publishers own the game IP. Player contracts, we've seen numerous player contracts across our desk over the last year, 18 months or so, and quite a few of them aren't worth the paper they're written on. Player transfers as well. There is, believe it or not, a nascent transfer industry developing within esports. It is still very embryonic. It's nothing like what you would see in football. There's no regulation around it, but it's a really interesting area. Chris Paget, who's on the panel later on this evening, has quite a lot of experience in relation to esports player transfers, and I'm sure he'll talk a bit about that. Participation agreements between teams and players, and also leagues and event organisers. Data. Esports is by its very nature a data-rich environment. Of course, we know from traditional sport the value of data as a commercial asset, particularly from a betting perspective. But of course, if you circle back, that still brings with it certain risks in relation to data protection and data privacy, and contentious issues, disputes as well. In any fast-paced, nascent industry whereby there's a commercial race going on, there's always going to be a potential for disputes. Okay. That's it for me. That was obviously something of a run-through of the esports industry. Hopefully I kept it as high level as possible and didn't overcomplicate things. But fortunately we have a fantastic panel to, I guess, excavate some of these issues in a bit more detail. First of all, we have Carly Morgan, who's a PhD candidate at King's College. Carly currently works as a research assistant at the Centre for Digital Culture. She's also an academic advisor for the British Esports Association and an ambassador for women and in gaming. Do you like those images, by the way, guys? No?
They're mortifying.
Jonathan, you sent that from the train on your... Yeah, fair enough. Malf Minns is MD of Strive Sponsorship. Malf's someone we've worked with a lot at Sheridan's in relation to a number of esports projects. He's regarded as an expert on sponsorship within esports and brings with him 17 years worth of experience within traditional sport. Jonathan Tilbury is strategy manager at Game Digital PLC, formerly strategy manager and esports manager at Multiplay, the esports content business. Game have entered esports in a big way with its UK Masters, its Beyond brand, the creation of arenas, grassroots and elite gaming arenas up and down the country. And John will give some insight from an event organiser, league organiser perspective. Josh Williams founded the Newell in 2010, which is the UK's inter-university esports tournament. And thanks to the work Josh has done, it's grown into one of the largest participation esports leagues in the country. Like Carly and indeed myself, Josh is also an advisory board member for the British Esports Association, which for those of you who don't know is the UK national body dedicated to grassroots gaming and promoting esports at grassroots level. And last but not least, Chris Paget, an associate at Sheridan's. Chris acts for a broad range of clients within the sports and entertainment industries and is a key part of our esports team, having developed particular expertise on the player side, player contracts and player transfers, and also in relation to the exploitation of media rights and content rights within the esports industry. And of course, the panel will be chaired by none other than Johnny Medill, another of our esports team members, who's obviously got a lot of experience in this space as well. Johnny, if I could just hand over to you to bring the panel up to the stage.
Thanks, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. As Andrew mentioned, my name is Johnny Medill, and I'm part of the sports and esports group at Sheridan's. You've heard a little bit about each of our 5 panel members. In many ways, I'm in a very fortunate position, being able to chair a panel alongside 5 very experienced and esteemed industry experts. And I think it's fair to say that each of them bring and offer a slightly different perspective given their respective roles within the industry. So hopefully that will make for a vibrant discussion throughout the course of the next hour or so. Just to pick up on Guy's point at the start, there is the hashtag MN Esports, so please feel free to engage on Twitter. Monday Night Esports. Obviously Sky Sports are showing Monday Night Football, West Ham against Chelsea this evening. They've got Jamie Carragher and Gary Neville in the studio as pundits. I'm highly confident that our carefully selected panel will provide even better entertainment and analysis than them. So without further ado, you might recall the slide that Andrew put up during his presentation, which set out the stakeholder landscape. And I think it's quite a good slide because, as Andrew mentioned, it shows some of the crossovers between esports and traditional sport. But what it also shows is that esports is a very nuanced space. And for me, the most important stakeholder group of all is the fan or the consumer, because it's really the esports audience that has driven the success or the growth of esports in recent years. So I thought we'd kick off with a quick discussion about what does this demographic look like? Why is it that this valuable demographic that makes up the esports audience is so attractive? So Carly, maybe if we start with you, why is it, from your perspective, that this is such a valuable demographic?
Well, I think the first point to reiterate that Andrew mentioned over the course of his presentation is that the main demographic of esports does skew predominantly young and male. So if you were just to survey our panel here for an accurate measure of the gender breakdown in esports, you might be getting a pretty clear view of what the global population of your average esports consumer looks like in terms of the gender relationships.
What are you saying about age?
So in terms of age, that's a good point. The average esports consumer is somewhere between, I'd say, 16 to 32, 35, although if you're getting really down into the discrete details about specific titles and you're narrowing your focus to particular games, then I think you might see that window narrow even in a more refined way, something like 18 to 24, which tends to be, can everyone hear me? Okay, which tends to be a correlative to the age range at which you might find someone working in the professional gaming sphere as a professional gamer. This is to say that, as Andrew again highlighted, one of the resounding motifs of the presentation is that esports is very fragmented and very heterogeneous. So to talk about an average esports consumer is to talk about a portrait of an individual that assembles a lot of different qualities globally. And it's also quite a complex picture. So what do we mean when we talk about consumption? Are we talking about people who might regularly watch Twitch streams and subscribe to certain people who make a living off of their streaming platforms? Are we talking about people who have esports merchandise and like to purchase merchandise that is emergent in and around a particular game title or a particular kind of game character? Are we talking about people who frequently attend esports events and go to these live, incredibly well done, very sleek productions that are very sophisticated kinds of exercises? Or are we talking about people who play the game regularly? So there's all these questions to be alert to as we try and craft what looks like the ubiquitous universal portrait of who the standard esports consumer is and what they look like. That said, I think that one of the main reasons that the esports industry is so enticing to brands and enticing to non-endemic sponsors is because this is traditionally an area where they've been meeting with a little bit of resistance in terms of developing these relationships with brands and with consumers. And this is something that I think Mouth can talk about with even more expertise than I can. But esports, in particular people in the esports industry, especially at the level of the grassroots organizations, so people who frequently consume the content and like to play the esports titles that are available, are highly passionate, highly dedicated individuals, and they also happen to have a little bit of disposable income. So those kinds of qualities make them very appealing for non-endemic sponsors and indeed endemic sponsors to develop these close working relationships with members of the population.
Just picking up on your point about diversity generally, particularly in the context of females, what do you think the industry therefore needs to do to make it a more welcoming and attractive industry for women and girls?
So the first point to raise is that it is not the exclusive prerogative of women to talk about women's issues in the esports sector or in any other sector. So I am speaking about women's issues here because I am deeply concerned about the kinds of structural and systemic biases and the way that resources are allocated in esports and the kinds of public platforms that women are allowed to appear on. And it's certainly the case that we need a lot of voices who are aware of the issues concerning the gender breakdowns in the esports industry, and we need people in positions of power, irrespective of their genders, to be leveraging their influence, their contacts, their networks, and their resources in order to make sure that women are permitted to play as they want to play as competitive gamers and aren't daunted by the levels of, say, structural sexism or harassment that indeed is very much a hallmark of lots of different industries that rely on digital technology so heavily. So representation here is not just an issue of tokenism, but it's really about thinking about representation as a concrete visualization of the kinds of ethical codes or value systems or ideologies at work in this system that might be invisible but come to the fore when we think about, who is offered a platform, who is offered a sponsorship deal, who is allowed to stream and under what conditions, who can make a sustainable, lifestyle and working occupation out of being a competitive gamer, and why. So I think, to sum it all up, the important question is not to ask why aren't there more women and girls in this space? Why is that a problem? But to invert the logic of the question and to see the gender breakdown in esports not as a problem, but as a symptom of a larger series of problems that involve constellations of cultural expectations and social relationships and indeed economic considerations as well.
Just to add to that, I think sport more generally, I think has challenges around engaging a female audience and participation base, and I think lots of it, from my angle and where I come from, is the premise on which people are trying to engage with women as well, because there's almost an assumption that you just need to, I don't know, make it, what you're doing for guys, make it pink or whatever it may be. Women are a different audience to men, and within the female gender there are different audiences within those, and people need to spend more time to understand that. At the top level, Nielsen Sports did some research a year or so ago looking at the gender divide in sport. And more broadly, and it was interesting because I think the guys at Coca-Cola and Under Armour talked about this and making similar mistakes when they first started to use female ambassadors and try and engage a female audience, was they went about it the wrong way. Males tend to engage in elite sports, and I would imagine in esports as well, although I've not seen the research. From a competitive standpoint, it's about who wins, who loses. It's about being the best. It's about the gold medals and the podiums. Whereas if you look at sports, generally speaking, the female audience are more interested in the narrative around the individuals. How have they got there? What's the story? Winning and losing will have different levels of importance to different groups within that. But there are different reasons to engage, and I think more needs to probably be done to understand if there is if there's a will there to try and engage a broader and more diverse audience. There needs to be more time spent understanding that audience rather than just putting stuff out.
Carly, you mentioned the fact that esports has become enticing to brands, and obviously we've seen a major influx in recent months in not just endemic sponsors and brands, brands that are synonymous with gaming entering the space, but also in particular major traditional non-endemic brands. Andrew mentioned a few examples. The likes of Gillette, the likes of Adidas, Audi and Visa have all made a fairly significant entry into esports in 2017. So Malf, do you think that we've reached a point now whereby these major global brands are at a stage where they're comfortable and they're willing and they're ready to fully commit to esports, whereby if we'd been having this conversation 6 months, 12 months ago, that might not necessarily be the case? And do you think this trend is likely to continue?
I think there's many different factors to kind of think about when you're answering that question. The first one is kind of building on what Andrew said and Carly said around the audiences. To start with, the so-called millennial audience is a difficult one to reach through traditional media and through traditional mechanisms, whereas if you look at the density of the esports population, it's, as Andrew said, it's predominantly that kind of male audience. So for brands who are trying to engage with them, they need to go to places where those that audience is engaging. What also helps is kind of the level of maturity of esports is such that its commercialization isn't as developed as a traditional sports world. So your saturation of brands is less, so your cut through of message is easier. But I think there's extraneous kind of factors as well that kind of mean that brands have got more comfortable. I think some of it we need to recognise, we need to look at the world in its entirety. So Europe is kind of behind, if you like, the US and Asia in terms of its maturity. So whereas we may only be starting to see non-endemic brands getting involved in esports, there's already been earlier entry in the US and in Asia, so I think we need to be careful about looking at it through our own lens. It was quite telling. I was at an event a year ago in Fulham, and we were talking about esports. And the first question a very well-known and large telecoms business asked was, who else is in it and what are they doing? I think there's a natural fear amongst big brands, although everybody talks about innovation and wants the first mover advantage. Actually, their belief and faith in actually going and doing that lags far behind their verbalization of wanting to be truly innovative. I mean, within the esports space, you have the usual suspects of Coca-Cola and Red Bull, who are often the first non-endemic brands to get in there and set the trend. And I think, to answer your question, we are seeing more brands come into it, because I think esports itself as an industry is becoming more structured and able to deal with those relationships. I think there's more information around to understand what is the esports industry, how does it break down, who are the consumer. There's more brands engaging, so there's more points of reference to understand actually what can I do. And it's a much easier sell when you go internally and you start talking about people playing computer games and how you want to engage with them, and people, to be honest, who are my age and above, who look at computer games of people locked away in a room on their own, not engaging with other people. And actually it's the complete antithesis of that, whereas now esports is all about community and connectivity. It's all about, groups of people and not individuals, and it's about changing those mindsets. So that prevalence of information is allowed to change that conversation. And I think we'll only see more brands get into the space as it matures, as more people do things. Much like, my background, as that terrible picture showed earlier, is quite current, I guess. I set up and ran the commercial program at Team Sky in cycling. So cycling back in 2010 in the UK was a very different beast to what it is now. But with Sky going in there and setting a trend, you then started to see brands like Gatorade, Jaguar, other brands coming into there because they took their cues from brands and what they were doing. And I don't see any difference for what's happening in esports.
And just to lead on from that, at a high level, are we seeing a typical type of activation from brands? Is it a case of a commercial tie-up with a leading team, or are we seeing different sorts of activations and routes in?
I think to be honest, the commercial entities within esports are very similar to that within sport. So often your decision makers who are making decisions about going into esports as a sponsorship are the same people that are investing in music, film, sport, fashion, whatever it may be from a partnership standpoint. So in terms of what's available, event sponsorships, team sponsorships, individual content plays, those kind of structures are largely the same. I think what esports does offer that's different, and you alluded to it with your broadcaster model, is it's much easier to own a piece of the commercial landscape. So, again, just to play on Sky, they own Team Sky. They created that entity as a team, and therefore not only is it a marketing platform for them, but, it gives them broader opportunities. Within esports, because of its state, it gives brands an opportunity to take ownership of something rather than attach their brand to something. So I think that is a real difference. The challenge also, and again we talked about it earlier, and I think it'll be interesting as the industry matures to see what happens, is IP. So what do we mean by that? And apologies, I'm not sure of the audience makeup, so if I'm teaching you to suck eggs, I apologise if this is patronising. But within sport, any of us in this room could create a football tournament, and we could monetise that through selling tickets or teams or whatever it may be. And there's a standard rule set there. If we were to do the same in esports, essentially we're using the intellectual property of somebody else. If we're doing a League of Legends, we need permission from Riot because they own that game. It's their intellectual property. Any marketing or commercialization we want to do, we need permission from them. At the moment, and Andrew talks about it, depending on who your publishers are, there's different levels of guidance or things that you need to kind of adhere to in order to do that. So that's kind of, I guess, an added complication that's navigable, absolutely, right now. But as time goes on and as more money pours into this, you may actually find that you're having to start paying a license fee to those people to use things. So actually building a robust business model might be more challenging because you might not be able to see what costs might be coming down the line. Valve all of a sudden might want 10% of your annual revenues if you're going to be doing anything in, CSGO or whatever it may be. So I think, there's an opportunity, but at the same time, you need to have that kind of long-term view.
So you make a very interesting point when you talk about the role of the games publishers within the esports landscape, and I suppose that's another example of just the nuanced bespoke industry that is esports. Here you have games publishers that ultimately own the game IP. So maybe a question for John. Firstly, how significant is the role of the publisher within esports? Might seem like a broad question. But secondly, can you give us a bit of a sense of the differing approaches taken by some of the leading publishers?
So publishers are hugely important because they have the ability to pull the rug from under your feet at any point. You're building anything you build in esports, you build on sand, because that publisher can control everything that they want to control. Riot, as you pointed out earlier, Andrew, are the typical controlling publisher, and they look for everything. So they're looking to regulate the rules that are used. They're looking to regulate the way that players are employed. In fact, they employ the players themselves. They control the ways in which the leagues are run, in which teams are promoted, and they will not issue licenses for third parties to run events above a certain size. It just won't happen. So they really want control of everything, and they use esports primarily as a marketing platform. So for them, it's a huge part of their brand's identity, and they don't want anyone spoiling that. They want it to be delivered in a certain way. You then have Valve, who are at the complete opposite end. So Valve have no interest, or very little interest, in controlling the way that esports works. They provide some structure. They benefit from it commercially by building these in-game items that they sell as part of the tournament experience for the fans, and they'll take a cut of that and they'll share that back with the players, they'll share that back with the teams and any tournament organizer as well. But their approach is very different. So you'll find a lot more third parties involved in organising tournaments for things like Counter-Strike and Dota. They do have structured tournaments that they bring into place, particularly with Dota 2. So the stats earlier for the amount of prize money that these guys have won, these esports players have won, it can be a little bit skewed by this one annual competition with a prize pool of about $20 million that's entirely crowd-funded by the community, and that tournament is run by Valve themselves. But for the most part, they will let people do things. You look over at what Turner are doing in the States, and for the first season of that competition, it was based on Counter-Strike, and they were able to do that with relative confidence. That Valve weren't, as long as they kept Valve happy, they weren't going to pull the rug from under their feet. They were building a proposition on something sustainable. Another model that's really interesting is Psyonix. So Psyonix found themselves in a fairly unique position. Their game was hugely successful, but in a somewhat unexpected way. They really created the perfect esport because it's understandable. You don't have to have played the game to understand it. You can watch it and you understand the idea of cars playing football is fairly simple. So their game was hugely successful, but they didn't have the manpower, the resources to follow through, to come up with a strategy for how they could use esports to market the game and to find commercial success. So they then sort of outsourced the esports element to Twitch. So that's another way that publishers have approached esports. And there are a lot of advantages and disadvantages for this, but ultimately it's a scary market to be in because you never know what's going to happen next. You never know when somebody is going to come and pull the rug out from under your feet. And I think, it'd be good to discuss kind of the advantages and disadvantages that you guys see and with the way that the current ecosystem works.
It's probably worth giving a bit of background as well, because I think John touched upon it. Feel free to jump in, guys, because I'm terrible at just, as you know, from being on other panels talking. Historically, I think it's fair to say that publishers allowed esports to happen almost as a retention tool. So they make their money either from a revenue from selling the game or, as John said, in-game purchases. And so esports, competitive gaming, whatever you want to call it, essentially creates longevity within their game. New releases means more purchases, more in-game. So esports helps elongate that kind of how long a game is relevant for. And for every new release, you're obviously making money. I guess once that started to build, if you like, in terms of its own revenue stream, in terms of selling tickets, development of merchandise, now kind of paying for broadcast rights, sponsorship, it's starting to be seen as a revenue stream in its own kind of way. Now, let's not kind of kid ourselves, it's still at the moment, I don't think there's probably anyone out of the publishers that are probably making money on esports, because they're still very much at the investment stage of building a commercial property. But they're all have created or are creating their esports teams because they can see the long-term potential and the long-term value of this as a commercial entity. And they're having to upskill because, again, their skill set is in producing really immersive games. It's not in creating commercial sporting infrastructure as we may know it, doing sponsorship deals, servicing those, creating broadcast platforms, player contracts, all of the kind of stuff that Andrew and the guys were talking about earlier. But now they're taking more ownership. We're seeing more and more of, or at least I am in my world, of the publishers wanting to own things. Not just because I think they're realising that the bigger the audience gets, the less control they have over their own brand, because essentially, albeit they're giving guidelines, other people are essentially becoming the guardians of their brand, and how they behave reflects on their brand. And if they're making their money still mostly out of selling games and or in-game items, they're still going to be judged on those decisions other people are making, so they need to take a little more control. Equally, they're seeing it, like I said, as a long-term revenue opportunity. So I think, that at the same time, and I wouldn't be surprised to see going forward more and more control being exerted. You've only got to look to Activision and the new Overwatch League to start saying, actually, they want to own that and they want to run franchises and own the teams, a lot more centralised model, more similar to Riot.
And there's another strand of logic here, which is if you look at the kind of, I say traditional esports model, the commercialisation of esports is kind of new. If you go back 2 or 3 years ago, the idea for the publisher was that esports really was just a marketing platform, and it was brilliant for them because 10 years ago they would have spent £100,000 on marketing. Now someone else will spend £100,000 on marketing for them. So an ESL will put on a tournament where they'll be investing a huge amount of money to promote, and they'll be promoting that title as a result. So they love it. But the community has to get to a certain size for it to be worth it for the third parties to invest. So if their tournament's going to get 100,000 concurrent viewers, then that's of interest to a brand. If it's going to get 1,000 concurrent viewers, then it's probably not. So the publisher will invest up to a certain point to try and reach that critical mass of viewership. Now, the problem that you have is that every player is different, so they'll have different preferences on what game mode they want to play. Some of them might want to play capture the flag, some of them might want to play some sort of free-for-all mode, some of them might want to play team deathmatch or one of these other game formats. And if they all decide to do different things, and they decide that their interests lie in different parts of these games, then that community will never reach the critical mass. So the publisher, like a lot of publishers, take a degree of ownership over what's called the generally accepted competitive format to ensure that that community reaches critical mass. And they will enforce things like the rules that are used in your tournament. So we do, with multiplayer, we did 3 Hearthstone majors, and because our tournament offered $30,000 in prize money, which was $20,000 above the kind of the threshold for the publisher to come in and regulate it, we had to use a certain rule set. We were only allowed to, treat the players in a certain way. Decisions had to be made following a kind of a process tree, and that was all to make sure that every player stayed committed to this one competitive format, this one way of playing, to ensure that the community got to the point where there were enough viewers for people like us to come in and say it's worth us doing this tournament.
If we take a step back and sort of build on what both of you have just said and consider the media rights landscape, we could probably have a panel session in itself just on media rights within esports, but unfortunately we don't have time. But Chris, given your expertise and work in media rights, obviously the success of esports has revolved around Twitch and other streaming platforms streaming huge amounts of free and accessible content. Albeit the media rights landscape is nuanced, we obviously have a significant number of major traditional broadcasters who are very active in the market. Andrew mentioned some topical examples. But Chris, can you give us a bit of an insight into, I suppose, where has the media rights landscape come from within esports? Where is it at now, and where do you think it's heading?
Yeah, certainly. I think when we talk about the media rights landscape, we should, I suppose, delineate it from traditional sports. They're worlds apart. Traditional sports, media rights revenue underpin the sports model. You only have to look at especially in top tier sports, the rights fees that you're paid for Premier League, BT recently announced, I think today, the Champions League, they're very vast figures. That's not the case in esports. Actually, esports has to date gone down a different route, which I suppose is reach over revenue. They've gone for critical mass. It's a free-to-view offering. To date, as Andrew said, it's about 90% of all content is streamed on Twitch. So it's been, I suppose, the lifeblood of esports is how it's got to this stage. It's been able to service fans with content, from premium content from the major events down to players practicing, down to, I suppose, social communities in their own right engaging over esports content. Inevitably, though, with a market that is developing, with a market that's becoming more sophisticated and more commercially driven, that landscape is changing. We're not seeing rights fees for media rights like we are in sport, and I don't think we ever will, in truth. But the market is in a state of flux would be too strong a way of putting it, but they are acutely aware of the need to firstly monetize their media rights, because they need new revenue streams, both from a growth perspective but also from a sustainability perspective, because as the slide showed at the beginning in Andrew's talk, or sorry, in the middle of Andrew's talk, the prize money, there's a lot of it, but it's kept very much at the top. And for that to continue to grow and for that kind of traction to continue, you need to be servicing and helping grassroots, which obviously Josh knows far more about than I do. But media rights is traditionally, within sport anyway, one of the main ways of doing that. The money comes in at the top and it filters its way down. So I think there's an appreciation, definitely, of the need to shift the focus, but that's not an easy thing to do. It is entrenched, it's digitally entrenched, it's digitally native. It has pretty much to date been free to view. The esports demographic is one which, albeit is relatively affluent, is used to having, again, to use the sports terms, I suppose, the Premier League, the Champions League and the World Cup, all on the same platform, all for free. So they need to balance the need, I suppose, for creating revenues with the ability to continue to reach the same audience and new audiences, and how they go about doing that is going to be very tricky, I think. You can't adopt a purely exclusive model, a purely exclusive paid-for model. There has to be a middle ground somewhere, and I think over the next couple of years we'll start to see a shift as to how rights holders and stakeholders go about doing that. Again, trying to navigate the elephant in the room, I suppose, which is the publisher and the role that the publisher would play in, I suppose, the commercialising of their game.
I want to pick up on your reference there to the grassroots layer of esports and bring in Josh. As Andrew mentioned, there's perhaps a sense or an understanding among some people within the industry that esports is all about the elite professional layer at the top of the game. From your perspective, can you give us a bit of a sense of how important a healthy amateur participation space within esports is, and also give us an idea of where that industry is going, where that grassroots layer is heading?
Sure. So, I think grassroots is incredibly important for two reasons, mainly. I think what we're trying to do and why we do what we do and why I set the Newell up is I had a great time playing as a player. I was rubbish, so that's why I organise tournaments with people now. But we had such a great time. We still go away on holidays together, like pretty much every year as the team. And we each other about 10 years ago, and we had such a great time with tournaments, events, and stuff like that. And I want to introduce more people to that. And I think if you can do that, you get people more bought into esports, and through that they become more engaged consumers. They buy the merchandise, they keep watching, they stay invested for longer. And I think we've got to make sure we don't lose sight of the fact that video games is about playing video games, and it's interactive, and it's about getting involved, and the sort of spectator aspect of esports is incredibly important, but there's so much we can be doing around the sort of actually playing the game and participating and being involved. For example, from a revenue point of view, I think what's incredibly exciting and interesting is the way sort of things like crowdsourcing are helping to finance some aspects of the professional esports. So going back to the example of Dota 2, which I think Andrew and Malf mentioned, that's a 20 million prize pool that was largely crowdfunded by people purchasing in-game items. And there's other really cool sort of models that are coming out, such as you can buy stickers supporting your team to put on the side of your gun when you play Counter-Strike, and that's a revenue sharing model that some of that money goes to the publisher, but some of that money goes to the teams or the players. And I think that's a really cool way of bringing what's the actual core about what all this is, which is playing video games competitively, and sort of helping you get involved at a different level, which I think is incredibly important, which things like traditional sports and entertainment and other activities don't have the luxury of. And you can do this in a very sort of scalable and sort of like widely available way, because it's on the internet. And that changes everything. I think the other thing that's incredibly important about the grassroots is these are the future talent that are going to be working within the esports industry, and that's something that we're focusing more and more on now with the students that we work with. It's not just about the players when you think about esports as well. I think that's really important to mention. There's the lawyers, there's the commentators, there's the content creators, the people who put the tournaments on, the marketers. All these people are incredibly important to the success of esports, and we need to be attracting more and more talented people into the industry, and if we can be doing that natively through the people who have genuinely got an interest in esports from a younger age, and give them those sort of career opportunities, I think you can start to create something really exciting and really quite cool in the future, because these are millennials who get it, and they're going to come with all these new ideas, and coupled together with the guys who've got the experience from other industries. I think that's a really exciting proposition that you can build. So I think, just sort of like wrap all that up, we need people to be engaged in esports throughout the different levels, and I think getting people playing in tournaments and having that heightened experience when playing a video game helps to build that sort of commitment to sort of like the next wave of people coming through.
In terms of trying to develop that pathway and almost, I suppose, bridge the gap between the grassroots area that you're talking about and then the top end of the game, John, what are the sort of things that can be done to try and bridge that gap?
Yeah, so hopefully this won't sound too self-absorbed. Talk about what we're doing at Game at the moment. So we decided to take a slightly different approach to what everyone else was doing about 12 months or so ago. And we decided, rather than going after the sort of the top of the sports pyramid, going after this broadcast-based proposition that really we weren't resourced or experienced enough to do. We decided to use the assets that we've got, our stores, etc., to build something at the grassroots. And we started by asking all of our customers what they thought. We've got a very sophisticated insight system. We're able to go out to thousands of customers and say, are you interested? First of all, are you aware of esports? And what we found was, of our representative portion of 4.5 million reward customers, 100% were aware of esports. So the first thing we learned is that esports isn't the way that we thought about it a couple of years ago, where it's this niche thing. Everyone knows what esports is, because it's embedded now within the games. You see the terminology, you see the language when you load the games up. Most of them were interested. Most of them had watched. Very few of them had played. And this is a stat that gets thrown around quite a lot, which is that 40% of the people that are involved with esports only watch. They don't play the games at all, that they're actually watching. So that was a fascinating stat. And we asked them, why haven't you played this game? Why do you just watch? And the top three results we got back were, first of all, they didn't think they were good enough. So clearly their needs hadn't been met there. The second one was, I don't have enough time, which again is somewhat understandable. But actually, I've got these in the reverse order. The number one reason was, I don't know how. So they had no idea how to get involved in esports. It's easy to flick on Twitch and see a top tier tournament, but how do you go about figuring out how to take your first step from loading the game up, and how do you go on that journey? And it was hugely important because if you look at it through the eyes of a publisher or even a brand getting involved in the space, the quality of the engagement for a brand is a lot higher if these guys are then watching the tournament and then it's inspiring to them to go play and participate. And if you're a publisher, you're going to make more money if the guys are actually playing the game rather than just watching. So it's really important. And what we've done is we've started to convert some of our stores into, we call them gaming arenas. Arena might be a little bit of a strong word, but putting in PCs, mini arenas, yeah, and doing tournaments at a local level. So another really interesting thing about esports is it's completely borderless, right? So if I set up a tournament tonight, I could have 20 million people join because you just need to be on the internet, which means very rarely will people have the opportunity to become a hero, to become a win. The skill range that can actually win a tournament is very, very small because it's so accessible. Although that sort of contradicts what I said earlier, but because it's so, the range of people that can play in any tournament that doesn't happen in something like football. So in football or really any physical sport where you actually have to be there, you are limited by the distance you will travel. So I'm terrible at football, but I might be the best player in the town that I live. That you don't get that experience with esports. And by building these physical arenas and actually starting to host physical tournaments, we're starting to make people local heroes. We're starting to give people the opportunity to win where they'd never had the opportunity before, which is fantastic because it means that those guys are then inspired to go on and continue participating as they and hopefully reach the top of the pyramid. Yeah.
We've talked a lot about the commercial growth of esports and commercial success, but one of the things that Andrew mentioned in his piece was that the commercial success of esports is inherently linked to good governance and regulation. So, Carly, from your perspective, again, comparing to where we were at maybe 12 months ago, are we now at a stage where the lack of regulation, is it still a barrier, or do we think we're at a stage where there are maybe sufficient levels of regulatory frameworks and governance in place, which is one of the reasons why maybe more brands are getting involved? Where are we at in that context?
That's quite a complicated question with a series of complicated answers, and depending on who you ask and where you're geographically oriented, you're likely to get completely contradictory responses. So Yuki, the UK Interactive Entertainment, recently published a white paper that was distributed to government, and they addressed this question: what is the need for regulation in the UK esports industry specifically? One of their conclusions was that minimal regulation is needed, and that what we really need to do is build better digital infrastructures, and eventually the market will regulate itself, and that will address a lot of the systemic issues that we're seeing in terms of regulatory oversight. I'm not quite sure if I 100% endorse that perspective. I think Andrew's point earlier is something that's worth reiterating, which is that to think about one kind of totalizing and homogenous governing body for an industry that is so fragmented and so diverse and so stratified really isn't the kind of solution that we want to propose either. So there really isn't a simple answer. I think that we do need some sort of third-party agency who might be able to negotiate between two parties in conflict. For example, at the competitive level, many pro gamers are increasingly finding that they're not getting paid on time, or there are certain aspects of their contracts that aren't well worded, and I think what was the phrase that was used earlier? They're not worth the paper they were written on, is what Andrew said. So having mediating agencies that can position themselves between, say, a player who feels exploited or slighted or isn't getting compensated, and having someone as a go-between who's able to commune with, let's say, the publisher, the coach, or the manager, and to come to some sort of conclusion would be a really useful thing to have in the industry, I think. In terms of regulation as well, I think one of the other things that we're seeing, particularly this year, are platforms like Twitch or services like Discord that are really central to the ecosystems of the esports industry, particularly in terms of developing relationships between fans and individual players, or fans connecting with each other, is that these platforms are often being co-opted by groups who aren't specifically using them for game-related purposes. So Discord is also being manipulated for use by the alt-right as a hub for radicalization, where they're coordinating a lot of strategic social media campaigns in order to control these narratives around, say, Marine Le Pen and the National Front in France. And what is the responsibility of, say, Discord as a corporation to step in and to moderate some of these discussions, or to censor or ban accounts that are harassing other users or spouting hate speech? We see this a lot on Twitch as well, with the Twitch live stream having a sidebar that permits people to contribute text, emojis, extra links. And ostensibly, Twitch has a moderating service. It's part of your, it's part of their kind of corporate, kind of ethical platform, right? That they have a means of identifying speech that is unsavory, and that they have measures in place to address that speech, or to limit the kinds of speech that a particular user can put forth publicly on this platform. But in practice, it's very, very difficult to regulate those kinds of spaces. So if there were, say, a third party that could set out a very clear guideline for what is and is not permissible on these platforms, and could, say, work with Twitch to develop maybe more proactive solutions to finding ways to moderate violent or harassing behavior or verbal abuse on these platforms, I think that it would ameliorate a lot of the issues surrounding kind of toxicity and harassment, and these questions of, what is the corporation's responsibility ethically, and not just what motivates it because of, the bottom line for profit.
That's a very good answer to a very difficult question. Well done. So you mentioned some of the integrity issues that are obviously prevalent in the industry: anti-cheat, anti-doping, match fixing, betting. Chris, from your perspective, player welfare is obviously something that Carly has talked about. Can you give us a bit of an insight as to some of the issues you've maybe come across? Andrew mentioned your experience in advising on player transfers. I mean, that's a good example. A, is that regulated, and if so, how challenging is that in comparison with traditional sport?
I think taking a quick step back, we've kind of touched on it throughout the panel, but it's very difficult to talk about esports as just, it's a nebulous concept. So when we're talking about the regulation of esports, whether we're talking about the governance of esports or player transfers, it's all, we can't look at it, on the whole. We need to look slightly more intricately at each of the titles, or each of the publishers, or even each of the competitions. So with player transfers, for example, all of the top leagues have now some form of regulation around player transfer. It's very loose. It's not as we are used to in the sporting world. You don't trade a registration, for example, but there are still trades that are going on within prescribed times. And it's very loose, and it will inevitably tighten up, I think, as the market consolidates, because one of the main issues with esports is just how fragmented the market is. The top teams will be playing in competitions that are run by maybe 5 different stakeholders, and so it's very difficult to regulate those teams across all of those different platforms, all of those different leagues. So you may have a set of rules for one league which doesn't apply to another league, for example, or you may have a set of rules which apply to one game that doesn't apply to another game, but a team may be participating in both of those different titles. So I suppose the short answer is it's not regulated, but it sort of is at the same time. The market has developed very quickly, and with the kind of professionalisation of esports has become, I suppose, the professionalisation of the teams, but they are still a long way behind what you might expect from a sophisticated employer. For a start, very few of the players are employees, and that brings with it certain challenges, I suppose. And the contracts that they have in place vary from good to awful, and everything in between. So when we've been involved in a few relatively high-profile transactions, and what you see is, for example, the lack of security that a team has over that player. The player has a contract with the team, but that's about it. There's no registration process, or only in a couple of examples will there be registration processes. So the team try and, I suppose, land grab as much as they can rights to make it difficult for the player to leave. And what form do they take? I suppose the most common is image rights. Within traditional top-tier football, image rights are a highly negotiated, highly sophisticated, highly legislated area where teams will take a license and they can exploit that person's image effectively on merchandising, sponsorship across their commercial kind of portfolio. In esports, you can see a team taking an assignment of that player's image right. So effectively, the player is giving his image right to the team. Now, the issue arises when that player tries to leave, and that's the purpose for the team doing it. They don't need an assignment; they could have a license. So I suppose it's a means of building security into those contracts. So that can involve negotiating out of those assignments. There are often large buyout clauses in the contracts, which can be restrictive on players moving. There's always a query as to whether those buyout clauses are enforceable. I won't go into the legal nitty-gritties as to why they are, but if you suddenly slap £1 million release clause on a contract, the chances are it's not going to be enforceable. But there's a kind of, I suppose, industry-accepted practice that if you induce a player to leave his team halfway through a contract, then you will pay him out for that to some degree, and that's one of the negotiated points. So I suppose bringing it back, there are a huge amount of things that we come across during the player transfer, and I suppose the sophisticatedness of those issues depends on the level of the transfer. But it's certainly an area that needs to be better regulated. You know, publishers are getting involved and setting minimum player terms, but they're not adequate, really, given what the players are expected to do, the amount of time they're expected to commit, and actually the amount of revenue they generate potentially for the teams.
There are so many esports game titles, and one of the things that I've always wondered is, and maybe Josh, you can kick us off on this one, is there a formula for a successful esports game title? Does that formula change through time? I mean, what are the secret ingredients of creating a successful game from a commercial perspective?
It's community, I would say. Like, you can make the technically best game in the world, but if if you don't sort of latch on to a group of people and start to become fanatic about it, then it's just not going to take off. I don't know from a technical point of view what makes that work. I think you're starting to see a big trend in, as we mentioned before, the games that sort of largely rely on microtransactions. So you buy in-game items. Whether these are sort of free to play or have a sort of like small, purchase fee, but they made the vast majority of their revenue from you buying a skin or a sticker or a better looking character or something like that. And I think that's what's really driving the revenue aspects of a lot of these esports titles. It's a sort of like typical game formula. You want it to be accessible and easy to sort of play, but difficult to master. You want to be able to really appreciate the top players and the sort of brilliance that and sort of genius that they bring to how you play. And then you want to go back and try it and find out you're rubbish and you're not actually as good as that person. I think that's from my experience anyway, that's what I think the sort of like main sort of ingredients. The sort of general sort of genres that are really big at the moment are sort of like the MOBA titles and the FPS. So the MOBAs, we are going into like too much detail if you're not familiar. It's basically a very glorified game of chess. You have different lanes and characters, and you've got to sort of kill each other so many times and basically push back to people's bases to sort of destroy them. And that's great because it's a very sort of there's lots of like technical aspects to it. You've got loads of different characters and different abilities, and there's lots of different variants there that makes it interesting and exciting. Which can be quite confusing from a spectator point of view, but it's sort of supplemented by how easy it is to watch because it's knowing from like a top-down point of view, and you can sort of grasp sort of spatially what's going off. And with the ears of the commentators, they help sort of break down what's going off to sort of like mere mortals like us. Then you got sort of your first-person shooters, which pretty straightforward. You run around, shoot people. And that's probably a better sort of concept to grasp and to understand, because it's quite relatable to something you can imagine in your head, and you get the objective. You need to go kill somebody, or go and capture a flag, or capture a point. But that can be quite difficult to watch to a certain extent, just because of all the action that's going off, and it's from the different angles and stuff like that. But again, the sort of if you produce that right, and you find ways of good camera people, and innovative ways of showing the data, then it's a really sort of like successfully watchable esports title. As we mentioned earlier, there's a certain amount of interest and skill and sort of appreciation that you can get from those types of games, which you probably don't get when you watch something like FIFA. Somebody playing FIFA, great, they might be better than you, but it's not as impressive as when we're watching Ronaldo or Messi play, or go and watch Premier League footballers play and stuff like that. So probably sort of lacks that appeal from a sort of spectator point of view.
So Malf, I'm keen to get your view on FIFA and other, I suppose, sports simulation games, because on one hand they're clearly gaining traction, and we saw BT Sport have agreed a deal in relation to FIFA. There's clearly growth there, but at the same time, as Josh touches on, from a viewership perspective, FIFA and other sports simulation games are lagging behind somewhat the major esports games. So from a commercial perspective, is there a glass ceiling there for the likes of FIFA, or will there be a shift through time?
So I think it's kind of plays to a lot of what's already talked about. I think it's really important to make a distinction between participation and fandom. So my frame of reference for esports is slightly different to Andrew's. So for me, esports is the elite competitive part. Competitive gaming is almost like your semi-pro. And then you may have, kind of mass participation, which is you playing on your own or kind of with other people. And I think with FIFA and EA, it has a massive participation base. But if you talk to somebody like Twitch, which is probably best placed on the basis that you don't get any scale of audience in an esports title unless there's a Twitch feed, they don't even class the sports genre of games as an esport. And that's purely on the basis that the audience is so small. So there's a massive participation base, but a tiny fan base. Now that might be quite surprising to a lot of people when you start seeing things like BT Sport have done an agreement, and you look in the French Football League, the Dutch Football League, and they've created their own esports leagues with a player per club, and Man City and West Ham have signed players. And I think, that's where you need to really spend time whether you're a sports entity or a brand or anything, really doing due diligence to understand actually what is esports and kind of what is that opportunity. Because if you're building, I would argue that West Ham and Man City don't have an esports strategy on the basis that FIFA is not an esports game. That's not to say it can't be an esports game.
So would you say that Man City and West Ham, their underlying objective there is really part of their overarching marketing strategy, which needs to be distinguished against the likes of Schalke and PSG, who have actually taken a step beyond that and established a standalone esports team? Would you draw that distinction?
So I think more broadly, if you would say, why do you think sports teams are getting involved in esports? I think relevancy is kind of the key thing. So I think it's a case of they want to, if the stats are to be believed, the average Premier League fan is 2 years older than the average age of the population. They're struggling to engage younger viewers. What are younger viewers doing? Well, they're gaming. There's a fragmentation of media. There's a fragmentation of interest. And so their point of view is, how do we stay relevant? And I think that's relevant to a current fan base. What other hooks can we put into them beyond our core football product? But I think it's also reach to new audiences. How else can we be relevant to those other people that we're not engaging with, or maybe are quite casual, but we want to more deeply engage with them to monetize them in a different way? So I think for them, it's definitely about engagement and reach. In terms of how they're doing it differently, for me, there's 6 different models of how traditional sports are really engaging with esports. One is kind of the signing a player. As I said, I'd argue that's probably not an esports strategy, and I think it'd be interesting if you chat to West Ham and City if that's working out for them. I think they saw it a bit as a content play, as well as there's a nice brand match. They're a football club, it's a football game, that kind of fits. Esports going really big. I'm not sure how much diligence they did beyond that and how much return they're getting. I think that you've got then, to your point about Schalke, what I call the Barcelona model. So Barcelona articulate themselves as an entertainment brand, not as a sports entity. So yes, they look at what other football clubs do, but they benchmark themselves against Disney, who they consider to be the best entertainment brand in the world. As they say, Disney has Disney World, they have Camp Nou, Disney has Mickey Mouse, they have Lionel Messi. So the ingredients of what those entities are, but they're very much, football is one product, basketball is another product. And I think people like Schalke, PSG, Philadelphia 76ers have taken that approach of, we are an entertainment brand. Our target market are consuming different products, basketball, football, esports. And I think that's their approach. You've then got almost your collective approach, which is what you've seen with the Dutch Football League and the French Football League, where it's, I don't just want a player and I don't just want a team, I also want to own a league. So I can commercialise the individuals, I can commercialise the team, and collectively I can commercialise the league. Much like Premier League is made up of member clubs, that's kind of how they've kind of approached that. You've then got the integrated model, and Formula E are really probably the only people that are doing this. And that's where actually performance in esports can affect the sport. They're starting to integrate gameplay with actually what happens in terms of their core product. So you might see that each team will have a gamer who will qualify them for the grid. They will then race from that position. I think there's more and more integration between gaming and core products, and for newer kind of commercial entities, that's an easier thing to do. It's not necessarily right for every entity. You're then seeing a brand new model, which is what I would term a strategic partnership. So AS Roma and Fnatic, one of the brands we talked about earlier, where AS Roma, rather than doing their own thing, have partnered with Fnatic, another, a team that has lots of teams and different things, and they're using their esports knowledge with AS Roma's kind of football knowledge and brand, and there's a mould of the two.
So is that effectively a cross-pollination of audiences? Is that the driver there?
I think it still comes back to relevancy. I think it still comes back to how can we continue to be relevant to our audience and deeply engage them. How can we build more relevance to new audiences? I think it's just a different mechanism of getting there, where they recognise that maybe they don't have the in-house expertise to appeal to an esports audience, and it's just a fusion of esports. We know how to run a successful sports enterprise. Let's merge the two. I think that. And then the sixth one is content, which again, for me, is not really an esports play, but you've got a lot of vloggers and, you've got a lot of gamers that aren't elite players in their own right, but commentate on the scene and have big fan bases, of their own, volition. And I think they're really the six models. I've talked to a couple of football clubs that are looking at, do they actually partner with a vlogger who essentially is a social commentator, if you like, on the scene, and they house that within their digital presence, and try and harness that audience to cross-sell, to reach new people, to develop different products.
I'm conscious that Josh is to catch the last train home from St Pancras in...
I think we're good until past.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. In that case, we'll crack on. I've got a question for all five of you, and that is there a recent event, trend, development within esports that you personally think is particularly significant in the context of shaping the industry going forward, and perhaps is something that we'll look back on in months or years to come as being particularly significant? So we're going to start with Josh and work our way on the table.
No time to think. But if I'm allowed to sort of plug the sort of space I'm working in,
plugging is allowed. Is plugging allowed?
Yeah, I think the sort of university space is really interesting. It's great in this country, but if you take what's happening in the US, obviously everything they do at universities on steroids compared to the rest of the world. So that's probably looking into the future. But I think there's 21 colleges in the US now that offer scholarships for esports players. And they're onto their official varsity programs, so they represent their universities in, as an official, representation. which is really cool. And those matches, the sort of finals are getting broadcast by people like ESPN, and there's the Big Ten Network, and all these sort of big players who are in sort of the traditional collegiate sports scene within the US are now getting involved in esports. And I think from talking to those guys and what those are doing, I was talking to one university, and I think they had 20 members of staff looking after their sort of like 25 players or something like 25 players, something like that. So they literally had like coaches and everything for each team from like team 1 to 5 going down. These are all employed by the university and stuff. And I think that's really exciting, seeing how the education system can help provide this sort of structure into professional career. Like I was saying earlier, not just about the players, but it's also about all the other skills around that too. And I know that's something big that they're pushing on, and we're trying to push on in Europe as well. And there's examples of us in France, in Germany, in Italy, and Portugal, Spain, etc. I mean, we're all sort of working together to create like a European Union, which is obviously not the most fashionable thing to do right now, but we're giving it a go anyway. And we're trying to come together on seeing how we can promote the collegiate scene in Europe, and a lot of the big developers and stuff see this as a very important development. To start with, you've got an absolute gold of a demographic. You've got 18 to 24 year olds, which are sort of like the core of the sort of like esports player base. But you've got the future generation of talent coming through, and that's obviously incredibly exciting and valuable. And if those people want to take those skills into esports, then we've got a really exciting time ahead of us.
Chris?
I think it's probably the recent streaming deal that ESL did for their Pro League. So they've moved away from Twitch and done an exclusive deal with YouTube Gaming. It's not necessarily the biggest deal in the world. It's not financially, that is. But what it does show is competition in the market, I think, which will only create more deals of a similar nature, will have people thinking more about which platforms that they're streaming on, and brings with it all of the associated benefits from a commercial perspective.
Connie?
I would definitely have to echo Josh's comments on universities being really integral, both in terms of dedicating resources to grassroots, community-based esports organizations, and also in terms of providing capital and infrastructure for developing players in a more competitive setting as individuals who are on scholarship. But my background and particular remit is not necessarily in the commercial areas concerning esports. So in terms of projecting maybe longer into the future, I'd say over the next decade or so, we're going to see a lot of developments that leverage the possibilities in esports for machine learning and the development of artificial intelligence. So an esport, or a particular title, particularly something like League of Legends, the multiplayer online battle arena format, is a virtual world that is enclosed, where you can operate particular kinds of characters. You make predictions, there's expectations about their behavior and how that's going to adapt based on the kinds of input that you're introducing into the system. There's lots of little levers that you can tweak to change minute things about the game that might have dramatic repercussions for the overall outcome. And I think that using a game like League of Legends, or indeed like StarCraft, which some of you may be familiar with, as is already the case, there are scientists and researchers using StarCraft to develop new interventions in machine learning technology. So I think that is an area we're going to see esports become particularly useful in as an incubator for new developments in machine learning and artificial intelligence.
Mine's kind of similar to Chris's. I think for me, audience is king, whether it's in esports or sports, and at the moment Twitch owns that. And I think their vertical integration, so they've gone from a streaming platform to also organising their own tournaments, to now, as of last week, also announcing they're going to start selling games. It's one of the problems football clubs have, is a lot of their engagement is through digital channels that they don't own. So a lot of their engagement is through Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, all the things you're familiar with. Yet who's making the money out of that? Well, it's those platforms, not them, which is why they're starting to do things like Dugout. So what I think is quite telling is that Twitch are vertically integrating, because I think that's going to take more revenue out of, you know, the hands of the publishers. And albeit that it's diversifying with other players, I would be quite worried if I was a publisher and I continue to keep feeding these platforms my audience because I'm giving them ownership. I would be looking at how I could work with my fellow publishers to take that ownership back before it gets too late.
The thing that interests me the most is fragmentation. So, and I think Newzoo talked about this a lot in the most recent report, which is the kind of the next step for esports is a strange one in its evolution, because it's kind of completely the opposite of traditional sport, which is we need to go from this global place that I spoke about earlier to having these regional competitions, because they are essential for making sure that players' needs are met and there is that path progression. I think I've used my self-promotion allowance already, but there's some guys out in the States that you should all go and look at the stuff they're doing. They're called Super League Gaming, and they're actually interesting for two reasons. The first is that they've done this city-based franchise esports thing, so they're making it local. They're creating local champions. The second reason it's interesting is because they're looking at League of Legends at the moment, but they started with Minecraft. So they didn't go after the 18 to 24s, they didn't go after the 16 to 35s, they went after children. And their proposition is quite simple. It's you turn up with a laptop, you sit down in the cinema with loads of like-minded players, and you take part in Minecraft challenges, and the game world is displayed on the cinema screen in front of you. So it's fantastic. It works really well at local level. I think what we'll see over the next year is we'll see more local leagues established. So we've got our UK Masters, ESL have their national premierships. We'll see more competitions like that are about creating, finding the best talent in a certain region rather than at a global level. And I think we'll potentially see the publishers coming in and trying to harness that as well. So even the really controlling publishers like Riot, their resources are limited. They can't run an esports league in every country in the world. They can run Europe. They can run, at the World Championship level. But I think they'll be looking more to partners in each region and potentially investing in each region as well to make sure that the infrastructure is there to support more of a traditional sports model where you have that journey from your local pitch to your national to your European to your world.
So I think we've ran over time by about 2 minutes, which I think is a pretty good performance. So unless anyone thinks otherwise, Dan, I think we should go to some Q&A, if you agree.
Is that okay? Yeah? The question I was going to ask, that might be my phone messing around. Are you potentially worried about how fast esports is growing, especially in like a legal aspect? I jumped to that conclusion because of the law in general is formed over hundreds and hundreds of years, whereas esports is like a maximum of say like 30 years, especially with like millennials like myself and people continuing to grow up that are delving into gaming. It's not like kids grow up and they naturally go through contracts and so contract law is easy for them, you know? Whereas esports, like kids are growing up with this. So is it dangerous, or is it an opportunity for like generation after generation growing up with video games are going to kind of be adept in the knowledge of the games, the lore of the games, and then also potentially like the legal aspect as well? So there's a few questions there.
Who wants to jump in?
Well, I think the first point is that esports law is not a law. Like sports law is not sports law. It's still fundamentally contract law. So a player contract for esports is governed by the same law as if it was a contract for any other service. Of course, there are bespoke commercial nuances to it, but there's not a risk, I suppose, from that perspective. The regulation of esports is something that, as we've kind of discussed, needs to be improved, and that's inevitable. You know, it's been a relatively meteoric rise into the kind of the commercial world and into commercial consciousness. And with that, of course, there's going to be a bit of lag time, I suppose, in terms of regulating it. But then sport is not exactly the best model to look at either, is it? So, and that's been going for hundreds of years. In terms of will it assist people in learning the law, not necessarily. If they are, let's say you're a young player coming through, I presume that was the kind of the context you were coming at it from. If you're a young player coming through the ranks, for want of a better word, then clearly at the moment it's under provided for, under catered for from both a commercial and a legal, a brand, and pretty much every perspective. But that will inevitably develop. You know, it's an incredibly fragmented marketplace at the moment, with stakeholders, people jumping in left, right and centre. But that will inevitably consolidate as market forces take effect. You only need to look at, from a player perspective, the rise of agents. You know, in the last 6 months, predominantly out of the States, there are 3 or 4 big esports players who have made moves in setting up player agencies. Now, why are they doing that? Well, they're doing it from a commercial perspective because there's revenue to be generated there, but it's also from a protectionary perspective. You know, agents get a bad rep because of the horror stories you hear about football agents, but they are there to, first and foremost, protect their clients. Yes, they have the added benefit of making money out of the back end, but they are there to protect their clients. And as there's more money involved in the system, the more chances of that sort of protectionary layer of representation will happen. But even on a kind of grassroots level here, you know, there aren't many law firms, for example, that deal in esports, but we get a huge amount of queries like, can you have a look at this, can you look at that? And we're willing to do it, I suppose. And there are a lot of other people within the market and within the industry that are willing to give up their time to assist. And that's one of the beauties, actually, of the esports market, is just how open everyone is. You know, there are a lot of people, and we would fall into that category, that have, you know, become involved in esports recently. It's not, we don't proclaim to be avid esports fans, but they're, you know, we've upskilled ourselves in esports. We have brought what we know from other sectors of the commercial landscape, I suppose, and people within the esports industry have been incredibly open and willing to teach us, to upskill us. So it's a relatively, I suppose, a relatively open space where there are plenty of places that you can turn to for advice. So it's kind of a long way of answering the question, I suppose.
Thank you very much to the panel. Last week I went to a presentation on the exploitation of children in football and some of the regulations that FIFA have introduced in order to sort of control that aspect. And is there a concern that, given the attraction of esports to minors, to children, that there's a risk of exploitation, people being taken advantage of, and of course the mental health implications, the educational implications of that? So how about the welfare and the ethical side of the involvement of children and the potential exploitation of children?
Can I the mental health bit is something that's really close to me, because I'm finding that a lot of the players are not, the big pro players now are not mentally equipped for the kind of changes that they're going through, and it causes the industry a huge amount of problems, because you've got these investors, these venture capital firms coming in, they're putting a huge amount of money into what is essentially a bunch of 18-year-olds who fight each other online, argue like non-stop. There's roster instability that causes all sorts of problems, and it means that, you know, if you're an investor and you're looking at it, you're thinking, well, I would invest this amount, but there's a 50-50 risk that this is going to go wrong, so I'll invest half as much. And if we can solve these problems around instability, which I think a lot of that does come as a result of mental health, we'll be in a much better place. So as an example of this, you look at the hours that these guys play, and I don't mean how long they play, but actually when they play. So your traditional player start playing when they're like 12 years old, and they'll play when they come back from school. So they naturally start to play later in the evening. They're starting to sit down and play after dinner. They'll play at 7, and they'll play through to 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way until 6 a.m. And that doesn't change. So even once they become a full-time player, they're still used to playing at midnight. And they'll talk to the other teams and they'll book scrims and practice matches around those sort of times, which means they're constantly fighting with their own bodies, because their bodies don't want to do that, but they do, and there's no need for them to do that once they reach the kind of the top tier level. We could, as an industry, change it, but it's just, these guys are so used to it that you're putting a huge amount of money in these guys. Do you want to put that at risk of them not liking you because you're trying to change something that they've been used to doing for the last 8 years? But yeah, it's a really interesting point.
I just want to add an addendum to that, and I think the comment I'm about to make synthesizes a couple of strands of conversation that we've touched on and also relates back to the first question, and it's that one of the forecasted trends for the esports industry that hasn't come up in conversation, and it's actually quite astonishing that no one's mentioned it, is professionalization. And this idea that there's going to be a trend towards streamlining the professional development of individuals working in the industry. And this emerges in things like hosting educational development sessions where you bring in tier 2 or tier 1 players and you walk them through all of the indicators of how to spot someone who might be trying to poach them in order to convince them to fix a match or to potentially get involved in some of the more unsavory aspects of the esports industry, or to be pressured to sign a contract that isn't quite legally sound. So I think we're going to see a lot of these kind of communities start naturally developing leadership training, start naturally developing skills training for things like, the professional behaviors and codes of ethics you need to have if you want to break into the esports space as a journalist, but you have no formal training. Most of the people who are working in media production, content development, in and around the esports industry don't have the advantage of going through these very concrete educational training programs the way that you could if you wanted to be, say, a traditional sports psychologist or a sports physiotherapist. So everyone who's working in the industry in that capacity of doing sports psychology or sports physiotherapy has managed to move into it because they found ways to constructively position themselves in order to effectively pivot into the esports industry. And I think that the development of these kinds of skills training and leadership training programs will be able to address some of these issues surrounding avoiding exploitation, averting ethical quandaries, maybe limiting the amount of integrity issues we have. So that's definitely something to be on the alert for over the next few years.
Just very quickly, we touched earlier on about the growth of betting markets within esports, and I think just to build on your question, on one hand, huge commercial opportunity in terms of the growth of betting markets, but at the same time, as we've talked about, we've got young players at the very bottom of the food chain who are earning peppercorn amounts, who are absolutely ripe for manipulation from a betting integrity match fixing perspective. So I think for me, that's probably at the top of the list of integrity concerns for the industry, I think, which needs to be addressed.
Sorry to be the party pooper, but I've got to go. But feel free to crack on without me. You don't really need me, but yeah, thank you for listening anyway. I was going to suggest I leave some cards if anybody wants to get in touch. So apologise, I can't hang around. So I'll leave them. I mean, it hurts less if nobody takes them when I'm not here. So do what you want with them.
I'll swoop them up for you.
Yeah, cheers.
Just on behalf of the panel, I'd just like to thank Josh for his time and his contribution this evening. Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.
So I think we have time for a couple more questions.
Can I touch on a point which really takes forward the point made by the first questioner, which is an aspect in which esports does provide a unique challenge to all of us as regards law, which is the transnational aspect. There's no other sport where participants can be engaged in more than one national jurisdiction. It's possible for somebody in Fulham to be engaged in an e-sport with someone in Hamburg, for example, and elsewhere. So this raises some transnational legal issues, which no other sport I can think of raises. And so it's, in that respect, is esports perhaps a sort of a Wild West challenge in legal terms?
I think Good question. I think it depends. I presume it depends on the platform on which you're playing and the rules that govern your participation in whatever activity it is that you're undertaking. If it was strictly to do with gameplay, for example, it would be governed by the platform. If it was to do with harassment, then I imagine it would take, it would probably be the jurisdiction that you were in at the point that happened, much like it would be from I don't know if you were using Twitter is a good example. That is totally multinational. But if you defame someone on Twitter, then you would take advice as to which area you would enforce or look to enforce your rights against that person. But Andrew might have.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, I guess one potential way to deal with the point you're making is to build arbitral mechanisms into the esports community, into the esports industry. Obviously, arbitration is a form of dispute resolution, I guess, popular within, indeed endemic within traditional sport, and there's no reason why that approach to dispute resolution can't be built into esports as well. And at that point, back to the first question, you might start to eventually build, I guess, an esports jurisprudence, an esports body of law, which might, I guess, become applicable in the future from a precedent perspective.
So when we see TBS bringing in the E-League competition for Counter-Strike Global Offensive, we see that they have like the base broadcast system, and then they have what I would kind of consider to be a premium type broadcast, which you then have to turn onto their channel to view. So when I would watch it, I'd watch it from here in the UK, and I could only see what was on the stream. I couldn't see the rest of the content. So my question is that since this is already happening to a certain extent, do you think that there can be the potential for pay-per-view instances in esports?
Yeah, I think one of the reasons you see that is touches on the point I kind of talked about when we talked about what are the like kind of big issues going forward, is people are trying to attract the audience back from Twitch to their own platform. So to do that, they need to offer something different. And I think they're trying to offer that premium, or more premium, I should say, experience to try and bring people, let's say, to MLG or to Gfinity, GTV, rather than on Twitch. Could that be carried further to a paid platform? I don't see why it couldn't, to be honest with you. It might not be in the near future, but at the end of the day, the audience will define, what they'll do. At the moment, as the panel said, people are used to free content. But as the norm starts to change, as production values increase, as tournaments aggregate, and as the market at large evolves, I can't see a reason why it couldn't evolve into a pay-per-view model. In terms of the time frame for that would be very difficult to kind of look at, really.
We're in a strange position at the moment because Twitch has such a monopoly on gaming streams. Right now everyone needs Twitch. Everyone needs to be able to stream on Twitch because Twitch has the audience. So Twitch isn't about delivering your content to your audience. Twitch is about finding an audience to deliver your content to, if that makes sense. And in that sense, it's almost like a marketing tool that you can't do without. So if you were to come in and offer a pay-to-view stream, the fact that wasn't on Twitch would be your first. Forget the paywall. Your real barrier is the fact that you're not doing it on Twitch, because you're not necessarily going to get the viewership that you expected, that you actually need. Now that's going to change very, very quickly, because with all these new platforms, and the one we should really touch on is the publisher-owned broadcasting platforms as well. So was it 56 million that Activision acquired the
MLG.
The assets for MLG, so that's a similar to E-League. It's an enhanced viewing platform, but that does all the streaming. Similarly, Microsoft just acquired Beam, so they've got their own platform as well. And now that those publishers can leverage the content rights behind their game, they can say, Twitch, no, you can't have our game content on your platform anymore. Suddenly, the market becomes a lot more open, and at that point, we're likely to see more more content acquisition, more people actually purchasing content because they see the opportunity now. It's worth YouTube buying some content from this person because there's a genuine prospect that someone will watch it and they can grow their market share. Similarly, we'll see the things like pay-per-view become viable, where at the moment they are completely viable. You know, I don't think there's any question about whether it will happen or not. But to your point, Malf, it's the way the landscape is right now, it's not going to happen for another few years at least.
I think it's worth saying as well that when you're streaming largely the events, they're making pennies from the ad revenue they're getting back from Twitch. Even the big tournaments, they're getting millions of viewers, might only make 30,000-40,000 quid. But what they're getting is an audience that they can say to brands, okay, we're talking to, 2 million concurrent viewers for this amount of time, whatever it may be, so we can put your brand in front of those eyeballs, we can build that brand resonance, we can create events where people know about them, and we can sell tickets and develop merchandise too. So it's less about monetizing that, if you like, through its own right, and more about just amplifying what they're doing and putting themselves on the radar.
I think this is one of those subjects and areas that could go on all night. Maybe it will. Who knows? Brains, the people that are here. I thought it was a really fantastic overview and insight. Firstly, from Andrew, giving this sort of state-of-the-art approach, looking at all the different issues and contexts around that, and then all the individual panellists for giving their own particular insights to it. I thought it was fantastic. And thank you all for coming, and thank you for watching. If you were watching live, we'll find out the figures on that later on. We might not be
we on Twitch.
You never know.
Can we monetize our content yet?
Yeah, just to finish up by saying thank you all for coming. Thanks to Sheridan's, and thank you all very much.